This is the phone calls on the 29th. So at 12:35 a.m., the defendant calls John. That phone call is not answered. 12:34:09 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:34:38 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:35:09 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 12:35:35, the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:36:09 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered.
Trooper Guarino, let me stop you there for a second. Did you look into any internet connection between the defendant's phone and the router and the internet connection at Meadows Ave, John O'Keefe's home that night?
Yes. At 12:36:39 a.m., the defendant's phone auto connects to the Wi-Fi HATSFAM 123.
Are you familiar with the router at Mr. O'Keefe's home?
I have not done a look at it in person, but that's the known network that's listed under it. There's two, HATSFAM 123 and O'Keefe 74.
Did you learn the range that a connection must be in order to connect to his router?
Yes, so depending on the router, it's either a 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz radio band or signal band, I should say. Depending on which one it's connecting to, which band, it's either 150-foot indoor range or up to 300 feet outdoor. So, again, when you pull into your home, sometimes you can still be connected to your home Wi-Fi in the driveway.
And again, can you give us the time of the connection between the defendant's phone and Mr. O'Keefe's router at Meadows Ave that night?
Yes, 12:36:39 a.m.
Please continue.
At 12:36:40 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 12:37:08 a.m., the defendant calls John, and voicemail number 1 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman, would you kindly play the voicemail for 12:37:08? At 12:38:26 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:39:03 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:39:37 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:40:43 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 12:41:35 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 2 is left. Some beeping noises, appears to be a butt dial or accidental call. Ms. Gilman, could you play the voice message at 12:41:35?
The defendant then texts John O'Keefe at 12:55:31 a.m. on the 29th, "I'm going home." The defendant texts John O'Keefe, "See you later," at 12:55:50 a.m. on the 29th. At 12:58:19 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:58:47 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:59:24 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 3 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman.
John, I'm here with your fucking kids. Nobody knows what the fuck you are, you fucking pervert.
At 1 a.m. and 26 seconds, the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 1 a.m. 49 seconds, the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 4 is left. It's 1 second called, no sound.
Ms. Gilman. was it? The defendant texts John O'Keefe, your kids are cucking alone at 1:02 a.m. on the 29th. The defendant texts John O'Keefe, I'm back in Mansfield. The kids are home alone. 1:04:14 a.m. on the 29th. At 1:10:17 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 5 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman?
Yeah, it's 1 in the morning. I'm with your fucking niece and nephew. You fucking pervert. You're a fucking pervert.
At 1:10:44 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. At 1:12:18 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 1:12:46 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 1:13:13 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. Sorry. At 1:14:11 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 1:14:44 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 1:16:10 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 1:16:38 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. At 1:17:37 a.m., the defendant calls John. So when voicemail 6 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman?
John, I'm going home. I cannot babysit your niece. I need to go home. You are fucking using me right now. You're fucking another girl. Kim's sleeping next to me. You're a fucking loser. Fuck yourself.
At 1:18:38 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. At 4:38:14 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:38:49 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:39:39 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:40:05 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:42:05 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:42:54 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 4:45:10 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:04:27 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:21:28 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:21:58 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:23:26 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 7 is left with voice.
Ms. Gilman?
At 5:24:27 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:25:28 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:26:14 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:28:16 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:28:43 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:29:21 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:29:46 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:30:15 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:30:52 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:31:21 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 5:36:29 a.m., the defendant calls John. Not answered. 6:03:02 a.m., the defendant calls John, and voicemail number 8 is left with some voice and noise and background.
Ms. Gilman, could you play that, please?
Yes, I need someone to for you. 34 beautiful kidnapped your baby and cat notice now. I know. Where's the blanket? I don't see blanket, Terry. Yes, I need that.
We have the lights on, please.